This is Madame Gibbons, and this is the second part in the video sequence to review the passé composé. Again, this is not intended for people who don't know the passé composé. This is intended for students who've already learned it. So we're going to start in this video by talking about which verbs use avoir and which ones use être. And I'm going to take you a little bit more into the grammatical theory behind why we use avoir and être in different situations. I know in the past you probably received a list. These use avoir, these use être, and you just had to memorize. So hopefully maybe with a little bit of the theory and philosophy behind it, you can kind of learn it in a different way, and that might help. I've given you some sentences to look at here and sort of compare. So if we look at j'ai parlé français, j'ai regardé la télé, j'ai vu un film, je suis né en 1984, je suis allé à l'hôtel, je me suis levé à 5 heures. So on both sides of the examples, we see that there's something after the verb, okay? But the big difference is that if you look at the left, the thing that is right after the verb, so in other words, français, la télé, un film, those are objects of the verb. And so these are verbs that can take an object, and most often do, okay? On the right-hand side, on the other hand, the only things that are after these verbs are prepositional phrases giving more detail. And so you'll notice, like, if I say je suis né, I can't say any kind of object after that. I can continue my sentence, but the only things I can put after are details beginning with a preposition. So things like the year or the location or the time. I can't say I was born and then any other person or object. It just doesn't work in that sentence. Okay, I can't say I went and then another person or object. I can say I went to it or I went from it, but I have to use a preposition. So that's kind of a big clue that you have a difference between these avoir kind of verbs and the être kind of verbs. But I can say j'ai parlé français, j'ai parlé, you know, any other kind of object or language in that case. Okay? I can say j'ai parlé français en 1984. I can say je suis né all by itself, but again, it still applies that if I say je suis né, no object can come after it. Okay, and the same with the other examples. Okay, if you want to know the grammatical term for these, they're called transitive and intransitive verbs. So in other words, a verb that can act on something else, or verbs that can only be done by the subject without acting. If that's too much grammar terminology, then just ignore that part, okay? So, again, and another way to check this is by asking the question. So, if I say, j'ai parlé français, what did I speak? I spoke French. But on the other side, what did I born? There's no way to answer that question, and in fact, it sounds a little weird. So we know that there's something different about that group of verbs. Okay. And so in this case, you know, what if there's an answer, then we know it's a transitive verb, and we can use avoir. We should use avoir. But on the other side, if the answer is we can't answer, or myself being the subject, then that's going to be a different video. Okay? And there just again is a summary of this whole philosophy. Okay, you have probably learned some ways to memorize these things, some mnemonics. So I'm not going to write these down for you, but I'm going to just kind of walk through this diagram and say which verbs go where. This is a common way of memorizing which verbs use être, called la maison d'être. So you have passer, naître, aller, venir, revenir, rentrer, retourner, sortir, partir, coming out of the house, entrer or arriver, going into the house, monter, descendre, rester, devenir, tomber, and mourir. Okay, and you also have Mrs. Dr. Vandertramp. So that's an acrostic or an acronym that helps you remember which verbs use être. So that one you're probably familiar with. But then there are cases, and since you're in an advanced course, there are cases where you can use avoir or être, okay, depending on the usage in the sentence. So if we look at this first picture, okay, let's look at this guy right here. We can say in the past, il est descendu, he went down the escalator, okay? But the escalator itself is not going down. The escalator is more or less staying in place. He is the one who's moving in a downward motion, okay? Now in this image, this guy is taking down suitcases. Il a descendu les valises. So in this case, there is no object, or there is no object. Oops. But in this case, there is an object. And so you see, when we have an object, we're going to use avoir. When we don't have an object, or it's impossible to have an object, we're going to use être. The other ones that are kind of like that are sortir, okay, because you can go out, but you can also take something out, like the trash. You take out the trash. You can also use monter. So then there are a few other ones like that, but those are the main ones: descendre, monter, and sortir. Okay, and when we conjugate with être, it's almost the same process as avoir. So you have your present tense conjugation of être plus your participe passé. Okay, similar groupings, similar rules, but we have an extra step because we're using être. So we have to do agreement. So we're going to make sure that if our subject is feminine, we add an e to the participe passé. If our subject is plural, we're going to add an s. And if the subject is feminine and plural, we're going to add an es. And then just so you can see it in the negative, we're going to put our ne pas around the verb être only, and then this doesn't change. So that's the second part. And in the last section, we're going to be talking about reflexive verbs.